The air in the briefing room was thick with the weight of anticipation. Conversations buzzed like faint static, papers shuffled, and the faint scratching of pens filled the corners of the long oak table. Officers in crisp uniforms leaned over folders, their faces set in stone, eyes shadowed by years of duty. To them, the world was war, strategy, and sacrifice carved into numbers and maps. Into this atmosphere stepped Sophia, her hands trembling slightly as she balanced a tray of steaming coffee cups. To the men at the table, she was nearly invisible, just another young woman tasked with serving drinks, slipping in quietly so as not to disturb their important discussions. Her footsteps were soft, hesitant, as if the walls themselves demanded silence. Yet there was one thing she carried that silence could not hide. It was stitched to her sleeve, faded with time, a small patch of deep navy cloth. At first glance, it looked ordinary, an unremarkable piece of fabric clinging to a uniform that wasn't her own. But beneath the fluorescent lights, its faint symbol shimmered like a whisper from the past. Robert, the pilot sitting closest to the end of the table, glanced up absent-mindedly. His eyes moved from the coffee tray to her sleeve, and then they froze. His jaw tightened. The sound of shuffling papers dimmed as if the air itself had shifted. That patch. He knew it. He remembered it not as cloth, but as fire, sky, and sacrifice. Sophia felt his gaze, sharp and heavy. A chill climbed her spine. She lowered the tray quickly onto the table, hoping no one had noticed her nervous hands. But Robert did not look away. His stare had changed the room itself, and one by one, others followed his eyes until silence draped over them all. Her mind raced. Should she pull her sleeve down to hide it? Pretend it meant nothing? But how could she? That patch wasn't just a keepsake. It was the only piece of her brother she had left. The brother who had gone into the sky one night and never returned. She had sewn it onto her sleeve quietly, telling herself it was for comfort, never imagining anyone else would recognize it. But Robert recognized it. And not just him. The older officers shifted uneasily, some exchanging glances, some stiffening in their seats. The symbol was no secret to them. It belonged to a squadron spoken of only in fragments, their missions buried in silence, their losses never recorded in public reports. Robert's voice broke the quiet, low but carrying an edge that made Sophia's breath hitch. Where did you get that? She swallowed hard, setting the last cup on the table. Her voice cracked as she answered, though she tried to steady it. It belonged to my brother. He wore it on his final deployment. The room stilled further, if that was even possible. A pen stopped mid-stroke. A chair creaked as someone shifted uneasily. Then nothing. Only silence, thick as stone. Robert's gaze softened, but it did not lose its weight. He leaned back, eyes fixed on the patch. In that moment, memory gripped him like chains. He knew that emblem well. Every man who had flown in that squadron knew it. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a story, etched in fire, held by those who dared to enter missions others wouldn't whisper about. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. The memories surged, unwelcome but unstoppable. The roar of engines, the sharp crackle of comms filled with static, the sky burning red. He had thought he'd buried those moments forever, but now, with that patch staring back at him, they had clawed their way to the surface. Sophia stood rigid, her eyes fixed on him, searching for answers, for truth, for something the cold words of missing in action had never given her. And in that silence, Robert understood. She wasn't just a girl carrying coffee. She was the sister of a man he once knew, a man he had flown beside, a man whose memory still echoed in the depths of his soul. The silence stretched across the briefing room like a shadow that refused to move. Sophia's words had landed heavier than she imagined. She had meant them as truth, simple and unadorned, but truth has a way of unsettling those who try to bury it. Around the long oak table, officers shifted in their seats, their eyes darting from the patch on her sleeve to the hardened face of Robert, the pilot who could not look away. Robert's voice returned at last, quieter now, yet carrying something more than command. Your brother, what was his name? Her throat tightened, the sound struggling to escape. She steadied herself and spoke softly, each syllable carrying both pain and pride. Michael. The name itself cracked something in Robert. Michael. It wasn't just a name. It was a call sign shouted through calms, a voice cutting through chaos, a steady hand when everything else was falling apart. Robert's grip tightened on the edge of his folder, knuckles pale beneath the weight of memory. Sophia's fingers brushed against the patch unconsciously, as though by touching it she could feel her brother's presence. She remembered the night she sewed it on, sitting alone in a small, dimly lit room. The needle had trembled in her hand, just as her heart had trembled in her chest. She hadn't done it for attention. She hadn't even done it to honor him publicly. She had done it because she couldn't bear the silence of his absence. That patch was her anchor, the last piece of him that the world had not taken. Robert leaned forward, his elbows pressing against the table. His voice was rough, scarred by years of holding back. That emblem, only a handful of us ever wore it. We weren't supposed to talk about it. Officially, it doesn't even exist. He paused, his eyes narrowing, as though struggling between duty and memory. Your brother wasn't just part of the unit. He was the kind of man who carried others through fire. Whispers spread across the table. One of the older commanders cleared his throat, but the sound cracked before it became words. Another officer simply lowered his gaze, as though afraid of what truth might surface. Sophia looked at Robert, her breath uneven. I've asked for years. They never told me anything real. The reports were vague. Missing in action. That was all they said. But you know something. The desperation in her tone cut through Robert's defenses. He remembered the official orders, the instructions to remain silent, to carry the truth like a locked chest that must never be opened. But sitting across from Michael's sister, he realized silence was its own cruelty. He closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering fragments scattered long ago. That night, we were sent on a mission most of the world will never hear about. It wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of mission that strips away choice. We all knew the odds. And your brother, Robert's voice caught, his chest rising with the weight of memory. He carried more than anyone. Sophia's heart pounded. Her brother's image filled her mind. The smile that never dimmed, the voice that always promised protection. And now, here in this room, his shadow returned through the words of a man who had flown beside him. Robert leaned back, his eyes locked on the faded patch. I can't tell you everything. Some things remain buried, for reasons none of us chose. But I can tell you this. He wasn't lost in silence. He wasn't forgotten. He made sure others came home that night. The words settled like stones in her chest, heavy, but solid. For years she had lived in uncertainty, grasping at scraps of vague explanations. Now, even with pieces missing, the truth finally began to take shape. Her brother hadn't simply vanished. He had chosen to stand. One of the commanders finally spoke, his voice a low murmur. That emblem was never supposed to resurface. And yet here it is stitched onto the sleeve of a sister who deserves to know. Sophia blinked back tears, her fingers clutching the fabric tightly. She felt both exposed and strengthened. She had feared judgment, feared that wearing it would be seen as disrespect. But now, as the weight of recognition filled the room, she realized it was more than fabric. It was a bridge between past and present, between silence and remembrance. Robert's gaze softened. He saved lives, Sophia. Mine included. I've carried that night with me every day since. Seeing that patch again, it feels like the past has stepped into this room. Her chest ached, but the ache was different. It wasn't the empty pain of loss. It was the sharp ache of pride breaking through sorrow. Her brother's story wasn't gone. It lived in these men, in the silence that had turned to honor, in the emblem that refused to fade. The room was still, yet something had shifted. Respect hung in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Sophia stood taller, her trembling hand steadying. She had walked in with coffee. Now she stood in the presence of truth, and the patch on her sleeve glowed quietly beneath the lights, no longer a secret burden, but a symbol reborn. The officers around the table remained motionless, caught between silence and the unspoken weight of memory. For years they had buried the truth, locking away the pieces of missions that had never been meant for daylight. Now those pieces pressed against them, clawing out through the small faded patch on Sophia's sleeve. Robert drew in a slow breath, his eyes still fixed on her. Every part of him wanted to shield her from what he knew, but he also knew that lies of omission were crueler than the dangers they once faced in the sky. His voice, low and deliberate, finally cut through the heavy air. Michael was more than a soldier, he began. He was the kind of man who held a crew together when the odds turned against us. We all depended on him. Even when fear had its grip on us, he kept going. He believed the mission was never greater than the lives beside him. Sophia's lips parted slightly, the sound of her own breath quick in her ears. She had grown up with stories of her brother's stubborn loyalty, of how he would never let anyone walk into darkness alone. But to hear it confirmed by the very men who had flown with him, it struck her like a wave, pulling her deeper into waters she had only imagined. One of the older commanders shifted in his chair. His voice carried the rasp of age, heavy with regret. There are some missions we cannot document, not because they weren't real, but because their very existence would tear apart the fragile balances the world clings to. Your brother's unit carried out those missions. Sophia's hands tightened into fists at her sides, and in all those reports, all I ever saw were vague words. Missing. Presumed gone. Why could no one tell me the truth? The commander lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. Because truth is heavy, child, and we feared you could not carry it alone. Robert shook his head sharply. No, it wasn't about her. It was about us. We were told to stay silent, to lock it away. But some things deserve to be spoken, no matter the weight. His words stirred a ripple across the table. Some officers frowned, others sat straighter, but none spoke against him. The silence was its own agreement, its own reluctant permission. Sophia's eyes burned with unshed tears. He was my brother. I carried his silence for years. I carried it in empty birthdays, in quiet holidays, in the way our mother stared at the door that never opened again. Don't tell me I could not bear the truth. I was forced to bear it every single day. Her voice cracked, but it did not falter. The officers listened, many with eyes downcast, as though her words had pierced their defenses more deeply than any accusation could. Robert leaned forward, his face etched with both resolve and sorrow. That night, he said, when everything went wrong, Michael did what none of us could have done. He made a choice that saved lives, and I have lived with that choice every single day since. His sacrifice is the reason I sit here at all. Sophia's breath caught in her chest. Her brother's death had always been framed as absence, as loss without reason. But now, reason emerged like a faint light breaking through storm clouds. He had not been swallowed by chaos, without meaning. He had stood deliberately in its path. The young woman's voice trembled as she whispered, "Why didn't anyone tell me this sooner?" Robert's gaze held hers, unwavering. Because courage is often hidden in silence. But silence doesn't erase it. It waits, until someone like you carries the emblem back into the light. The words hung in the air, heavy yet transformative. The room itself seemed altered, less a chamber of secrecy, more a sanctuary of memory. For the first time in years, Michael's story lived again, carried not by reports or whispers, but by the raw truth spoken aloud. Sophia closed her eyes, her fingers brushing once more against the patch. Images of her brother filled her, his laughter, his firm hand on her shoulder when she was afraid, his promises that he would always look out for her. For so long, those memories had felt incomplete, broken by the unanswered questions of his disappearance. Now, piece by piece, the gaps were being filled. When she opened her eyes again, the officers around the table seemed changed. No longer faceless men of rank and file, they were witnesses. They had carried her brother's memory silently, and though their silence had wounded her, their recognition now felt like an unspoken apology. Robert spoke again, his voice steadier. "Your brother is not gone, Sophia. He lives here, in the lives he saved, in the men who carry his memory, and now in you." The weight in her chest shifted. Grief was still there, sharp as ever, but beneath it grew something new. Pride, strength, the beginnings of healing. She had thought the patch was her quiet secret, her personal way of holding on. But here in this room, she saw what it truly was. A spark of memory powerful enough to change the silence of men who had long forgotten how to speak. Her brother's story had not ended with fire in the sky. It was still being told, through Robert's voice, through the respect in the eyes of men hardened by war, and through the patch that rested against her sleeve, like a heartbeat that would not die. The room seemed to hold its breath as Robert shifted in his chair. His eyes, darkened by years of memories he had never spoken aloud, locked on Sophia's. He knew the moment had come. For too long, he had carried the silence of that night like a hidden wound. Yet here, confronted by the sister of the man who had saved him, silence felt like betrayal. Robert's voice was steady at first, but every word carried the weight of a storm. It happened on a night when the sky itself seemed against us. Clouds heavy as stone swallowed the stars, and the air carried a strange stillness, the kind that comes before disaster. We had been sent deep, further than usual, on a mission we all knew had little chance of return. Sophia listened, her body rigid, her breath sharp. She had imagined countless versions of her brother's end, but never once had anyone painted it with such detail. Robert continued, his tone sharpening. The engines hummed like restless beasts. Inside the craft, every man sat silent, masks of composure hiding the truth, that fear had its claws in us all. Michael sat near me, calm as always, his eyes steady, as if nothing in the world could shake him. He had that way about him, like he carried certainty in his very bones. He paused, his hands tightening into fists. Then came the strike. Out of the clouds, fire ripped through the night. The first explosion tore into the hull, alarm screaming in our ears. The comms filled with static and broken voices. It was chaos. We were blind in enemy territory, with no clear way out. Sophia's hand pressed against her chest, her heart pounding as if she too were inside that burning craft. Robert's voice deepened. Men panicked. Some froze. Others tried to fight controls that no longer answered. But Michael, your brother, he didn't waste a second. He moved through the smoke and fire like he had been preparing for that very moment all his life. He shouted orders, sharp and clear, pulling us back from the edge of despair. His voice cut through fear like a blade, and for a moment we believed we might survive. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy. But survival has its price. Another wave hit us. Flames erupted across the left side. We had lost almost all control. The craft was breaking apart, piece by piece. And that's when Michael made the choice. Sophia's lips trembled, her fingers clutching the edge of the table. "What choice?" she whispered. Robert's eyes met hers, filled with grief and reverence. He forced open the emergency systems, held the line himself so the rest of us could escape. He knew it would cost him everything, but he did it anyway. He stood where no one else could have stood, carried a burden none of us could have borne. His last words over the comms weren't fear. They were simple. Get them home. Sophia's vision blurred as tears gathered, but she did not look away. She needed to hear every word. Robert's voice faltered now, cracked with emotion. I saw him through the smoke, framed in fire. The craft groaned like a dying beast around him, but he stood firm, hands steady, face unyielding. We were dragged out into the night, parachutes opening into the storm, while he remained inside. And then the sky lit up. Flames consumed the horizon. His voice cut off, and silence followed. For a long moment, Robert could not speak. His eyes lowered, his jaw clenched tight. Around the table, even the most hardened officers bowed their heads, the memory pressing on them all like a tide that had finally broken free. Sophia could hardly breathe. Her brother's end had always been a shadow, an emptiness that gave her no peace. But now, hearing the truth, her grief transformed. It was sharp, yes, but it was filled with pride. Michael had not vanished. He had chosen. He had stood in the fire so others could walk free. Robert's voice, soft now, carried the final weight. I have lived every day since knowing I owe my life to him. His courage has haunted me, inspired me, and shamed me when I faltered. I thought silence was my duty, but perhaps speaking is the honor he deserves. He did not die forgotten. He died as a shield, and that is how he should be remembered. Sophia's tears fell freely now, but her chin lifted. Her brother's story was no longer a mystery carved in silence. It was a legacy, burning bright, carried by those who lived because of him. One by one, the officers around the table rose to their feet. No words were spoken, but their gesture was enough. The silence that had once hidden truth now became a silence of respect, of reverence. Sophia stood among them, her hand still pressed to the patch on her sleeve. She felt his presence, not as a ghost, not as an absence, but as a living flame passed from heart to heart. Her brother's story was no longer locked in shadows. It had been spoken, and in the speaking, it became immortal. The room was still, every officer standing in silence, their eyes lowered, their posture solemn. It was not the silence of secrecy anymore. It was the silence of honor, the kind that filled the air when words were too small to contain the weight of memory. Sophia stood among them, her hand resting on the patch stitched to her sleeve. For the first time since she had sewn it on, she did not feel uncertain or afraid. She felt strong, as though the fabric itself carried a heartbeat that had always been waiting for her to hear. Robert remained at the head of the table, his eyes locked on Sophia. He had spoken what he had never dared speak, and though the burden still pressed against him, he also felt something loosen in his chest. The truth had finally been given air. Michael's sacrifice was no longer just his private torment. It was now a shared memory, carried by those who owed their lives to it. Sophia's breath was unsteady, but her voice, when it came, was steady and clear. You all knew pieces of him. You carried the silence of his story because duty told you to. But I carried the silence because I was his sister, because no one ever told me why he never came home. That silence was heavier than you know. Her words cut through the air, not as an accusation, but as a truth that needed to be spoken. The officers shifted, shame flickering in their eyes, but also respect. They had seen many families left with unanswered questions, but few ever confronted the silence with such strength. Robert's voice followed hers, calm but firm. She's right. Silence protects the world, but it wounds the ones left behind. Tonight, the wound has begun to heal. Michael gave his life so that others could stand here, and it is our duty to ensure his story is never hidden again. The older commander, who had earlier looked away, now lifted his head. His voice was quiet, gravelly with age, but resolute. Then let it be remembered, not as a file buried in archives, not as a code we cannot speak, but as a legacy that lives in every man and woman who steps forward when fear tells them to fall back. Sophia felt her throat tighten. She had walked into this room carrying coffee, invisible to most, uncertain of her place. Now she stood among officers who bowed their heads not in pity, but in respect. She was not just a sister mourning the past. She was the bearer of her brother's legacy. She spoke again, her tone softer now. For years, I thought he was gone, that all I had left was this patch, this small piece of fabric that reminded me of him. But tonight I understand something. He's not gone. He lives in you, in the lives he saved, in the silence you carried, and now in the truth you finally shared. His courage didn't die in that fire. It's still here. The words lingered, echoing through the room. Robert nodded slowly, his eyes glistening though he tried to hide it. Courage never dies, Sophia. It passes on. It shapes those who come after. Your brother's choice echoes in every step I take. And now, through you, it will continue to echo. Sophia closed her eyes for a brief moment. She saw her brother smile, heard his laughter, felt his hand steadying her as a child. The ache of loss was still sharp, but it was no longer hollow. It was filled with meaning, with pride, with the knowledge that his life had not ended in silence. When she opened her eyes, she stood taller. The officers around her seemed to recognize the change, the quiet strength that had emerged from grief. She had entered the room unnoticed, a girl with a tray. She would leave it as something far greater, the living reminder of a hero's sacrifice. Robert's voice carried the final weight of the night. Your brother shielded us all. He made sure we had a future. And tonight, you've made sure his story has won too. The officers one by one placed their hands to their hearts, a silent vow. No applause, no ceremony, only the steady rhythm of respect filling the space. Sophia's tears finally fell, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of release, of pride, of recognition that her brother's name would no longer be lost in vague reports. As she turned to leave the room, the patch on her sleeve caught the light once more. It no longer looked faded. It looked alive, vibrant with the story it carried. Every step she took felt different, lighter. The burden she had carried alone for years was now shared, transformed into strength. She stepped out into the corridor, the echo of the room still behind her. For the first time in years, her heart did not feel empty. It felt full. Her brother's story was not over. It would live on in her and Robert, in every officer who had stood in silence and in honor. Because courage does not vanish. It echoes. It lives in the hearts it once protected, and it rises again when the world needs it most. Sophia left the building not as a shadow of loss, but as the sister of a hero, her silence replaced by pride, her grief reshaped into a story that would never again be hidden. And with every step, the echo of her brother's courage followed her, steady and eternal.